Hi everybody, welcome back to Anna Reads. You'll notice we've been through Snow White, Pinocchio, and for Walt Disney's third animated feature film we have, take a guess? Fantasia. So let's jump right back into Walt Disney, an American original by Bob Thomas. Luther is over there and I don't know if he's going to want to get in the picture. So let's check this out. We have Unit 1, Chapter 2. Walt Disney remembered nothing of his early years in Chicago, but the memories of Marceline stayed with him throughout his life. He recalled the place where he lived. It was a beautiful farm with a wide front lawn, big weeping willow trees. It had two orchards, one called the Old, one called the New. One variety was called Wolf River apples, and they were so big that people came from miles around to see them. Marceline was one of a multitude of towns that owed their existence to the railroad. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, I love that song, was spreading through Missouri in 1888, and a new village grew up beside its tracks in Lynn County near the center of the state, 120 miles from Kansas City. The first settlers decided to call the place after the name of the railroad superintendent's daughter, Marceline. By April of 1906, when the Disney family arrived to take over the Crane farm, Marceline had become a community of 5,000 people. They were hard workers. Some were employed in the nearby coal mine number 1, some in the oil and natural gas fields. Merchants sold their wares in the red brick and sandstone stores along Main Street. Sound familiar? Most of the population lived on farms, growing fruit, vegetables, wheat, barley, and raising beef and pork for the big city markets. Flora Disney arrived first, bringing her 3 youngest children, Roy, Walt, and Ruth. Elias Disney and the 2 older sons, Herb and Ray, came a few days later in a boxcar loaded with the family belongings, including a pair of horses Elias had bought in the Chicago stockyards. The family settled into the neat, square, one-storied, whitewashed house built by a Civil War veteran, William Crane, recently deceased. Elias had purchased the house and 45 acres at a price of $125 an acre, promising installment payments with money he was to receive for Chicago houses he had built. Elias and the 3 older sons went to work immediately, plowing the spring fields and planting large areas of corn and sorghum, lesser amounts of wheat and barley. Elias bought cows for milking, and pigs, chickens, and pigeons to feed the family. Can you imagine eating pigeon these days? I mean, ew. I really can't. Flora Disney worked constantly, preparing huge It's a can opening, Luther. What are you jumping for? Preparing huge meals, washing and mending the men's shirts and coveralls, hoeing the vegetable garden, churning butter to trade for provisions at the grocery store. I swear I just read this book. Her butter was so sweet and pure that the groceryman gave it special position at his counter. Walt, a wiry, tow-headed boy with searching eyes, tagged after his mother to help with her chores, and he was followed by little Ruth. We're out of Coca-Cola today. The farm and its surroundings were an endless source of wonderment to the boy. He played in the mud under a bridge near the house, waving shyly to farmer neighbors as they passed by in their buggies. He herded the pigs to new grubbing places, and they permitted him to ride on their backs, a feat that Elias Disney showed off to visitors. Walt gave special attention to a runty piglet he named Skinny. He nourished Skinny with a baby bottle, and the pig followed him around the farm like a pet dog. As one season blended to the next, Walt learned to anticipate and enjoy the cycles of farm life. During the sorghum harvest, his father and brothers cut the cane and fed it into a horse-powered squeezer. Walt led the horse around in a big circle until the cane was mashed. The molasses was stored in big vats and poured on breakfast pancakes or baked in cakes and gingerbread. If the crop had been bountiful, the excess was siphoned into brown earthen jugs and bartered at the grocery store in Marceline. Harvesting time brought the big, puffing steam thresher to the farm. The neighbors' wagons hitched behind it. While the men worked in the fields, the women filled the kitchen with gossip and the aromas of fried chicken, cornbread, and chocolate cake. I absolutely love imagining what that smelled like. I really, really do. At noontime, the men came to the house and ate huge meals, exchanging views about the size and worth of the harvest. Then they stretched out on the lawn under the willow tree and slept for an hour before returning to the fields. Hog killing time brought neighbors back to the farm, and they helped Elias slaughter the animals and dip the carcasses into huge boiling kettles. The bristles were scraped off, and well-honed knives sliced the remains for ham, bacon, sausage, and head cheese. I don't think head cheese is legal in the United States anymore. As Walt grew older, he wandered farther from the Disney farm, sometimes with his brother Roy. Nearby were woods overgrown with walnut, hickory nut, hazelnut, persimmon, wild grape, and chokeberry, all in their seasons offering food for passerby. Walt learned to watch for animals that lived in the woods: rabbits, foxes, squirrels, possums, and raccoons. He scanned the trees for birds: bobwhite, crow, hawk, woodpecker, meadowlark, cardinal, wren, swallow, and wild dove. On hot summer days, Walt and Roy walked the few miles to Yellow Creek and cooled themselves in the slow-moving water. The Santa Fe Railroad tracks ran through the countryside a short distance from the Disney farm, and Walt could put his ear to the rail to hear the train coming. Never do this. Never do this. He always hoped that the engineer would be his uncle, Mike Martin, who worked the route between Fort Madison and Marceline and often stayed with the Disneys overnight, bringing a striped bag of candy for the children. Another diversion for Walt was watching the horseless carriages chug by on the County Pike Road in front of the farm. They had just begun to appear in Marceline. Things happened to young Walt that he could remember with absolute clarity in his mature years. He wandered through an orchard on a summer Sunday and saw an owl on the branch of an apple tree. He reached up to pet the bird, but it flew away. Walt pursued, found the bird within reach, and put his hands over it. The owl screeched and clawed. Instinctively, Walt threw the owl to the ground and stomped on it. The boy was overcome by remorse to find the owl dead, and he buried it in a small grave. For months afterward, the owl returned in Walt's dreams. And if you'll notice, owls figure quite prominently in many of the films that were made during Walt's lifetime. The first that comes to mind is Friend Owl from Bambi. And, of course, The Fox and the Hound was made after Walt died, but Big Mama, I would guess to be a figment of that same manifestation, and Archimedes and The Sword and the Stone. The most persistent family legend about Walt's boyhood on the farm was always described as his first attempt at art. The incident was recalled by his sister Ruth in an interview almost 70 years afterward. My folks had gone to town, and Walt and I were left there alone. We spied a big barrel of tar and opened it up. Oh no. As we were looking at it, Walt said, "Oh, this would be real good to paint with." He added, "Let's paint the house." I wondered if it would come off, and he said, "Oh, sure." So we went to work on the long side of the White House, the side that faced the main road. What's bothering you, Luther? He drew houses, I remember, with smoke coming out of them, and I drew zigzags, 2 rows of them. We dipped big sticks into the tar, and I can remember the awful feeling when we realized a little bit later that the tar wouldn't budge. My father was so angry that he just left it there. It was still on the side of the house when we moved. Kids, right? I can honestly say I've never done anything that stupid, but I've come pretty close, and no, I'm not telling those stories on the internet for all to hear. No. His mother taught Walt how to read. Elias Disney decreed that it was more convenient for the boy to wait until Ruth was old enough for school, and Walt was almost 7 before he was enrolled at the Park School, a 2-story red brick building with 200 students in grade and high school. Walt read the standard text, the McGuffey Eclectic Reader, and studied arithmetic, writing, geography, and spelling. His grades were only fair because he was always finding things that interested him more than his schoolwork. Same though. One of his new discoveries was the movie house that had just opened in Marceline. One day after school, he persuaded Ruth to accompany him to the theater, and on the bedsheet screen they saw an enactment of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. It was dark when they emerged, and they hurried home, fearful of what would happen to them for staying out so late. Nothing did, because their parents were so relieved that the 2 children were safe. Been there too. The years in Marceline provided Walt Disney with a gallery of memorable characters. Warm-hearted Aunt Margaret, who came from Kansas City with crayons and pads to encourage Walt's drawing. Grandma Disney, full of mischief in her 70s, urging her grandson to fetch her turnips from a neighbor's farm. Uncle Robert Disney, an elegant figure who kept a cigar in his mouth even when his Van Dyke beard was being trimmed in the barber shop. Uncle Ed, considered dim-witted by outsiders, but by his family simply a boy who never grew up. Sound even more familiar? Walt found him a perfect companion, a grown-up who liked to do boyish things. They wandered the countryside together, and when Uncle Ed wanted to go to town, he simply flagged down the train and climbed aboard. Walt visited the nearby farm of Erastus Taylor and listened to the Civil War veteran recount the battles of Shiloh and Bull Run. Can you imagine speaking to someone for whom the American Civil War was within living memory? I've only ever heard recordings, and it still gives me chills. The boy rode into town with Doc Sherwood in black Prince Albert frock coat and beardless, having pulled out his whiskers one by one. The eccentric retired physician commissioned a portrait of himself and his prize stallion Rupert and paid Walt a shiny new quarter for his drawing. At first, Elias Disney was viewed with suspicion by his farming neighbors. He came, after all, from the big city, full of socialistic ideas. Some of the farmers, angered by having food processors and the railroad dictate terms, listened with sympathy to Elias's proposal to join the American Society of Equity. One night in 1907, he hired the Knights of Pythias meeting hall and invited farmers and their wives to a dinner. He had bought 5 gallons of oysters from Ed Hayden's grocery, and the diners admitted they had never tasted such good oyster soup. But they were less receptive to Elias's arguments, and his hope for a union of farmers in Marceline proved a failure. Despite his radical ideas, Elias Disney came to be well liked in Marceline. He was industrious and serious-minded, yet there was one note of frivolity in his nature. On Sundays, he hitched his buckskin mare to the buggy and rode to the house of Grandpa Taylor. For an hour or 2, Elias and Will Rensomer played on their fiddles to the piano accompaniment of the Taylor's daughter. Walt sat on a straight-backed chair throughout the concert, enthralled by the music and astonished by this unexpected aspect of his father. At most other times, Elias Disney was sober, even dour. The task of supporting a wife and 5 children on a prairie farm had proved more of a burden than he had anticipated, and he brooded over the possibility of failure. He demanded more of his older sons, and only Flora's quick humor forestalled open rebellion. By planting acreage Elias had rented from Robert Disney, Herb and Ray earned $175, and they bought themselves gold watches and chains for $20 apiece. For reasons I am not going into, I am exceptionally freaked out by pocket watches, just FYI. Their father accused them of profligacy and asked them what they planned to do with the rest of the money. "We thought we might buy a heifer and a colt," Herb replied. "No," Elias said firmly. I've got a lot of debts on this farm, and that money should help pay them off." For Herb and Ray, it was the final tyranny. At noon the next day, Herb rode a horse into town and withdrew his and Ray's money from the bank. After dinner, the 2 sons said they were tired from their day's work, and they went to their room early. Later, they slipped out the window and carried their bags to the Santa Fe station, boarding the 9:30 train to Chicago. That's a redbug. The loss of his 2 sons was a blow to Elias Disney and his hopes of developing his 45 acres into a prosperous farm. His efforts had been hampered by his own hidebound notions about farming. "Putting fertilizer on plants is like giving whiskey to a man," he expounded. "He'll feel better for a while, but afterward he'll be worse off than he was before." He was convinced otherwise when his neighbors persuaded him to fertilize a single patch of corn and observe the difference. Imagine that, science works. Had to convince my own dad the same thing, and he was an engineer from Georgia Tech. Go figure. That science works, not specifically the fertilizer thing. The well went dry in a Missouri drought. Elias dug others, but the yield was scant. His apples ripened when the market price was low. He buried the apples in layers of straw as his father had done in Canada. When winter came, the apples remained fresh, and the family peddled them door to door. Flora sold her butter to local residents, and Elias declared it could not be wasted at home. In a rare act of disloyalty, Flora buttered her home-baked bread and passed it butter side down to her children. I think I would have quite liked Flora Disney. The worst of Elias Disney's bad luck came in the winter of 1909. He contracted typhoid fever, then pneumonia. Roy assumed the burden of running the farm, but it was too much for a 16-year-old boy. Flora argued that the farm had to be sold, and Elias finally agreed. After 4 years of bone-wearying labor, he would get back only what he had paid for the farm. Roy hitched up the wagon, and he and his little brother rode through the bitter prairie chill to tack up notices on telegraph poles and fences, advertising the coming auction at the Disney farm. The 2 boys watched sorrowfully as their favorite animals were auctioned to other farmers. They had a special affection for a 6-month-old colt that they had known from birth. The auctioneers sold the colt to a farmer, and both boys cried as they saw it tied to the back of a buggy and led off down the County Pike Road. Later that day, Roy and Walt took the wagon into town to buy some provisions. As they were walking into the hardware store, they heard a persistent whinny. They gazed across the street and saw their colt tied to the back of the farmer's buggy. The colt had recognized them, and the boys raced across the street to hug it and cry some more. Elias had made plans to move on to Kansas City, but he and Flora agreed that the children shouldn't be taken out of school in mid-year. They rented a house in town at 508 North Kansas Avenue, and when school was out in the spring of 1910, the family left Marceline. Walt Disney had lived there barely 4 years, yet that period left more of an impression than any other time in his life. 40 years later, when he built a barn for a workshop on his estate in California, it was exact replica of the one he had known in Marceline. That has been Unit 1, Chapter 2 of Walt Disney, an American Original by Bob Thomas, and this has been Anna Reads in Fantasia Disneybound. The COVID-19 pandemic, panic, quarantine thing is still going on, and Luther is still over there where I can't reach him without becoming indecent in a dress. No, not gonna happen. But just your everyday reminder to please, please take care of each other and take care of yourselves. Fantasia doesn't have a whole heck of a lot of dialogue to it, so take this time to consider your music. Whether it's the kind that tells a very definite story, the kind that, while it has no specific plot, does paint a series of more or less definite pictures, or music that exists simply for its own sake, what we call absolute music. Tell me what you think. What's your kind of music? Give me a thumbs up, give me a like, hit that subscribe button. Feel free to contact me on Instagram at serenity_sweet13, on Twitter at serenitysweet13, no underscore. Whew, excuse me. Contact me on Facebook if you feel like it, or you can always direct message or comment right here on YouTube. I wonder if I can get away with this. Don't report me, okay? I'm just having fun. M-I-C, see you real soon. K-E-Y. Why? Because we like you. M-O-U-S-E. Love y'all.